So kind of like what Chandra said, this talk is drastically reduced to make it into 30 minutes. So this is a 30-minute version of kind of a bigger project, and these ideas are very much in flux in my head. So I'm really interested to hear what people have to say. So I'm just going to jump in because other people have talked a lot about mental effort in the first 2 days. So skip a lot of intro material about cognitive control and start to think about this construct of mental effort, what's sometimes called cognitive effort. And I have here in mind kind of subjective effort for people that have been keeping subjective and objective effort mobilization distinct. So as many of you will know, mental effort in recent literature on cognitive control is thought to be familiar in everyday life. It's ubiquitous across different variations of tasks and circumstances. And at least according to one approach, it's integral to the cost-benefit computations that are themselves really central to understanding how the cognitive control system allocates resources. So what follows here on this slide is my attempt to summarize, certainly not what everybody thinks about mental effort, but what a lot of people say about mental effort as a construct. And I'll go through these in a little bit of detail individually. But it looks to me like a lot of people think of mental effort in terms of 4 features. So first, independence. Mental effort's understood as a kind of independent variable in the explanation of task performance, and I'll talk about a little bit about that in a second. Second, consciousness. So mental effort's a conscious experience that people undergo when they're performing cognitive tasks. Third, aversiveness. Mental effort has an aversive or negatively valenced phenomenal character. So what it's like to experience mental effort is it's like something that you don't like. And then fourth, function. So the chief function of mental effort's closely tied to this characteristically aversive phenomenal character. And of course, there are different spins you can put on this, and there are different spins you can put on all 4 of these items, as I'll discuss in a minute. But you might think, the experience of mental effort promotes disengagement from a task or something like that. So just to go through these 4 items in a little bit more detail, independence states this basic point that we don't want to conflate effort with task performance. The relationship is not quite as clean as that. There are other factors to consider. Shinov and colleagues put a similar point kind of this way. So when they're giving a kind of explication of effort, they say, look, effort's what mediates between, on the one hand, the characteristics of a target task and the subject's available information processing capacity, and on the other, the fidelity of the information processing operations actually performed as reflected in task performance. So the first 2 factors, task characteristics and capacity, determine what level of performance is attainable in principle, and effort is supposed to refer to the set of intervening processes that determine what level of performance will in fact be realized. Hold on, I'm moving faces around on my screen. So Kuhl and Botvinnik, and they're quoting a bit from an Enslick paper too. So they're offering a somewhat similar idea. There might be an important difference. I don't know if I'll get into it too much in these talks, but they think of mental effort in this way. They say, look, mental effort is a subjective intensification of mental activity, which is what mediates between how well you can perform on some task and how well you actually perform on that task. So that's how some people are thinking of independence. Consciousness states this basic point about cognitive control, that it's often associated with the experience of mental effort. Now, there's definitely some room to maneuver with respect to the relationship between consciousness and mental effort and consciousness and cognitive control. And not everybody, of course, wants to give consciousness a central role. I mean, I think as philosophers, we tend to gravitate towards that, but there are good experimental reasons to cast a wary eye, towards research paradigms that lean too heavily on consciousness. Although I'm going to ask us to lean a bit more heavily on it later. So, Westbrook and Braver say this in an important paper: cost signals need not always be conscious to influence behavior, but they may become conscious when the costs are sufficiently high. And that's one way to suggest that, mental effort might not always be conscious. There are other ways you might think about the relationship between mental effort and consciousness. Now, aversiveness, when I first started thinking about this a few years ago, everyone was saying, mental effort is kind of inherently aversive, and that's often, or intrinsically aversive, and that's often offered as a piece of phenomenology. I think I had a paper actually. It wasn't a great paper, so this isn't the only thing, but I was kind of trying to argue that the phenomenology of effort might switch back and forth, and it kept getting these really harsh rejections, and I just gave up on it. But now people have started to publish the same idea and suggest it in papers that are better than mine was, so it's fine. But so I don't know how to pronounce Sekeli's name. But Sekeli and John Michael have argued that effort may at times be negative and at times positive, and Elizabeth was suggesting something in that direction as well. So here's just some quotes. I'm not going to read them all, but those of you that read the mental effort kind of literature, cognitive control literature, will come across lots of quotes like these. So Shinov and colleagues say, why don't people always simply perform at the highest level of which they're capable? The intuitive answer suggested about introspection is that we're constitutively reluctant to mobilize all available cognitive resources. Mental effort is inherently aversive or costly. And you find lots of quotes like that. Function is a little bit more complicated, and I think while lots of people seem happy thinking of mental effort in terms of the first three features, I think the fourth one's maybe a little bit more controversial. It's naturally connected to the first three features of mental effort, and it forms a part, I think, of many, at least implicit theories about mental effort, but certainly not all of them. But this might be clearest in Kurzban's proposal from that BBS paper in 2013. They build an initial function for phenomenology in by assumption. It's not something that they argue for. They just assume that subjective experience can be understood computationally as motivating the organism to behave adaptively. And then they go on to build on this, offering this kind of opportunity cost model. So felt sensations are the outputs of mechanisms designed to produce inputs to decision-making systems. And so the feeling of mental effort is the output of these mechanisms that are designed to measure the opportunity cost of engaging in the current mental task. And of course, that proposal in detail hasn't been, I don't think, widely accepted. There are lots of kind of similar proposals in a general cost benefit family where people will change the function of mental effort a little bit, but a lot of people seem to think it is connected to its role, its place in consciousness, but certainly not everybody. Now, why do I go through those four features? Well, one thing I want to do is just point out that these four features are in principle separable from one another. Right? I mean, so they don't all entail every other one, although function comes close. So you could endorse just the independence thing. Say, look, mental effort's an important independent variable in understanding cognitive control resource allocation, but I don't buy this stuff about consciousness. And so I don't buy anything about aversiveness, You could reject aversiveness as a general claim, and some people do that. They say, it's not inherently aversive. Sometimes it's aversive, sometimes it's not, and we got to understand why. You could endorse consciousness, say, these conscious experiences of mental effort are closely tied to cognitive control resource allocation, but either reject or be agnostic about function, adopting a kind of epiphenomenalism, perhaps, about the role of consciousness for cognitive control. Those are all open to the theorist. So, well, yeah, so there's one more thing I want to say about that. I do think this has come out in my understanding of what some of y'all have said over the past couple of days, just thinking through how some of what you're saying relates to what I've been thinking. I think there is a slight tension here when you look at these four features between this characterization of mental effort as a subjective intensification of mental activity, and then the interpretation of mental effort as a kind of output of cost benefit computations. Because the characterization suggests to me that mental effort is an action or closely tied to an action. So it's something we directly or voluntarily control. We intensify mental activity or we don't. And you might think that that's what's being monitored by way of cost benefit computations, as opposed to being generated by cost benefit computations. But that's a kind of half-baked thought, so I'll just leave that there. So regarding the four features, there are many subtle interpretations you might offer regarding mental effort. So you could reject or amend. I mean, I offered a little characterization of each of the four features. You could amend those characterizations. And every time you do, you're going to get a subtly different interpretation of mental effort. And to me, that raises this kind of question about the construct and about what we're talking about sometimes. Because look, it seems to me if the interpretation of a lot of these issues is just left to the reader, reading through proposals about cognitive control, it's often going to be not at all clear what exactly is being claimed. It's not going to be clear if what's being claimed is plausible, and you run into this danger of crosstalk between researchers, verbal disputes, changes of subject, and so on. So, I mean, I think it's important to be as clear as possible about how we're thinking of mental effort. And so, in the rest of the talk, I want to push towards one way of doing that. So, let me start out just by mentioning two questions, actually three, but the first two I'm going to just mention and then set to the side. Um, Questions we might ask about the relationship of consciousness to cognitive control. So first, this epiphenomenalism question, we can ask, do any of the candidate experiences, like mental effort, have a functional role for cognitive control resource allocation? And if so, what is it? Second question we could ask is the phenomenal character question. Do the experiences associated with cognitive control function in virtue of their phenomenal character? That is to say, should we take the aversiveness or lack of aversiveness or even some specific features of the phenomenal character to be important information for a functional characterization of cognitive control? Maybe not, not, I don't think every single experience would function in virtue of its phenomenal character, at least not directly. A lot of people think that pain kind of does function directly in virtue of its phenomenal character, and maybe that's true of valenced experiences generally, but that's a big question, and I think we have to leave it open for now. I just think we don't know quite enough to be certain how to answer questions like these, but I do think they're important questions. The question I want to look at a little more closely is this one. So I think, everyone agrees that mental effort is a kind of important independent variable in any explanation of how cognitive control operates, and probably in how resource allocation works. What sort of variable is it? And I'll consider, I think, four options. So one option is mental effort is the sole determinant of cognitive control resource allocation. So if we're going to understand cognitive control resource allocation, we just need to understand, you know, where mental effort is at any given point in time. I don't think anyone really thinks this. You could uncharitably interpret people as thinking something like this. So, when you think about the subjective intensification of mental activity, that seems to be a monolithic thing that varies by degree. And if that's what mental effort is, could take that to be the main thing that determines resource allocation. Sekeli and Michael say mental effort's a measure of the extent to which cognitive control inhibits or modifies default procedures. Um, you could take that to be a claim that, all that's going on with respect to resource allocation is the measurement of mental effort and the output of that. But I think most people allow interactions between other items, factors like fatigue and boredom, trait-based factors like the need for cognition, and a lot of others that have come up in this workshop. So a second option is that mental effort is whatever cluster of determinants science uncovers. This would be a kind of terminological decision to think of it in this way. And this idea was suggested to me by reading Shinov's stuff. So this 2017 review paper that he had with other co-authors, they talk about effort as the set of intervening processes that determine what level of performance will in fact be realized. So, right, certainly there's some set of intervening processes, and you might just choose to view all of these together as mental effort and say, we just need to understand the structure of these processes. We can call it mental effort. And I don't have a big problem with that. I'm not closely tied to how we're going to define mental effort. I think one thing to say is if we take that kind of option, kind of black box mental effort in a way, questions are going to remain about the identity and the structure of the relations between all the processes that make up the cluster. And then there is this kind of oddity that you might not care about, but there is this oddity about how this conception would relate to phenomenology. So an initial motivation for a lot of people is, the phenomenology of mental effort. But there's no great reason, I don't think, to think that the only phenomenal signature of a range of processes that implement control would just be an aversive feeling. Yeah, so I'm going to skip that. So that might lead you to a third option, which is to go eliminativist about mental effort. That is to say, we might replace talk of mental effort with more fine-grained notions as science progresses, as we fill out the set of intervening processes, and just say, we initially started out talking about this subjective intensification of mental activity that was aversive, and then we started to learn that there were other factors in play, and we could just replace talk of mental effort with talk of whatever the best models are kind of quantifying over. I think that's an interesting option to consider. So I'm just throwing it out there. But what I'm going to consider for the rest of this talk is this fourth option. So this option is to say perhaps mental effort, which we can understand in the kind of, I guess, intuitive way, introspective way that a lot of people do. So it's an aversive signal, an aversive experience that's related to the deployment of some package of control signals, some kinds of cognitive control operations, is one contributor to cognitive control resource allocation, among others, to be discovered or theorized about or whatever. And if this is right, then I think one important part of the task, the experimental task, would be the isolation of mental effort. Where does mental effort show up and why? The isolation of other contributors and the exploration of their dynamics. So I don't know if that's a fruitful way to think of it, but if that's how we want to at least proceed, just for fun for a few minutes, one question we might ask is, what does the science of cognitive control indicate about the phenomenology of mental effort? And there's a lot to say here. There's obviously a lot of work going back 20 years or more that relates to this kind of question. So a quick and dirty summary, which I apologize for, but there's time constraints. I think work on the phenomenology of mental effort is not terribly systematic, and that accounts of mental effort's role in cognitive control often look more like a generalization over a wide range of factors. So it's common in experiments on cognitive control resource allocation using any number of cognitive control tasks, task switching, go, no go, Stroop, this kind of stuff. To add a battery of questionnaires, either at the end or the beginning of experiments, is a way of collecting data about multiple motivational factors. And these multiple motivational factors might be interesting, but there's so many questionnaires, it can sometimes be hard to tell what we're generalizing over across experiments. Subjective effort, in a lot of cases, studies that purport to be about subjective effort, either implicitly or sometimes explicitly, knowingly replace subjective effort with objective measures like the demandingness of the task, and then just refer to demandingness and effort as synonyms. I think inferences about effort are sometimes made based on reports about nearby constructs. Things like difficulty, or sometimes it's how hard did you plan to try, instead of like, did you experience effort in the task? And these might be mediated by additional factors. Sometimes efforts collapsed with fatigue and boredom as a kind of monolithic thing. And it's not clear to me that that's super well motivated. So talk of effort is sometimes talk that collapses a lot of these different factors, and sometimes there's good reasons for that. Sometimes you want models that are a little more rough grained. So I guess I'm pushing here for something that might be a bit more fine grained. So let me talk a bit about what I have in mind. We can call it a variable phenomenology view. So we can distinguish between conscious cognitive work, that's a term I just made up, but it's the total set of experiences that might be associated with the direction of thought, and mental effort, which I want to say is only one feature of conscious cognitive work. And I think this is implicitly recognized in the science and in the philosophy on this. People speak at least as much of boredom or fatigue in a task as of effort, but I want to be explicit about it. So it seems to me that cognitive work is highly variegated. So you might be probing the memory, you might be exercising the imagination, you might be putting specific bodies of knowledge to work, bodies of knowledge over which you have more or less mastery, so it might be associated with different kinds of metacognitive experiences when you're doing this. Is there anything these various activities have in common phenomenologically when you're engaged in cognitive work? And so, I mean, what if we answered mental effort, the intrinsically aversive subjective intensification of mental activity? Maybe there's some mental effort in all those tasks, but this would, I think, get the phenomenology all wrong. In particular, I don't think that all cognitive activities are aversive. Similar ideas were coming up in Elizabeth's talk. So a variable phenomenology view posits a range of experiences as associated with cognitive control resource allocation. And I want to suggest that taking this range seriously as sources of evidence regarding the functions of cognitive control might open up avenues for a more positive program in cognitive control research with certain implications. So one thing we might think about in this connection is whether differences in negative experiences are relevant. And I'm aware that some work has been done on this, a lot of it coming out of Inslick's lab or people that Inslick collaborates with. But you think about differences in phenomenal properties that we might mark as experiences of fatigue versus boredom versus effort versus anxiety versus frustration versus despair. These might track different influences upon the cognitive control system. If so, it would be good to know. So experiments that map the ways that cognitive control tasks generate different experiences might provide valuable information for, models of cognitive control. And I also think as a place for philosophers to kind of get stuck into this as well, I think there's a need for theoretical work that tries to integrate research on effort with research on these other kinds of experiences. So there's work on boredom in philosophy. I think there's a whole book that the person's name escapes me wrote. There's a whole book on anxiety that I actually reviewed for a journal not too long ago. I don't know if there's any work on fatigue in philosophy, although the pandemic seems like a great chance to write about the philosophy of fatigue, Zoom fatigue, for example. Um, but I mean, it would be nice to have a coherent perspective regarding the impact of all of these kinds of things. And that's just on the negative side. So cognitive control research has already made a lot of inroads. I mean, there are literatures exploring fatigue and boredom and effort separately and to some extent together. But the exploration of a positive experiential side to cognitive control is I think, extremely limited. So you often do find, you get this important work by Yee and Braver and some of their colleagues on enhancing reward and ways that rewards can get integrated in cognitive control tasks. So if you enhance reward, then people are going to persist for longer on various tasks. But, and Inslick just pointed this out, changing the instrumental structure of a task might be importantly different from offering a task that's intrinsically rewarding. So Inslick makes this distinction between incidental emotions and integral emotions and suggests that incidental emotions, the kinds of things that might be manipulated by changing the instrumental structure of a task, might influence control dynamics in inconsistent ways, whereas you might find something a little stronger if you can find positive integral emotions. So this is real back of the napkin. Although Husky, I think, and co-authors have tried something like this in a paper I just came across this week. So you might consider a research program like this, a program that constructs cognitive control tasks that are fun for participants. Maybe I played too many video games during the pandemic, but it strikes me that a lot of video games are just kind of embedded, iterated cognitive control tasks in a kind of fun musical environment that gives you lots of reward. Um, and it seems to me like I almost never get tired of some of these games, even though all I'm doing is like repeated iterations of a go no go task or something like that. And Adam Gazzaley and colleagues have created this bespoke video game and demonstrated that it can enhance cognitive control abilities in older adults. They weren't looking at whether people found the game as fun, but it does seem to have an impact on cognitive control. It's possible that participants found it fun or engaging in certain ways. It would be interesting to see. And this connects with some things that Elizabeth was saying about whether you could cook up cognitive control tasks that look at flow in the lab. I mean, so flow research tends to be qualitative. They go out and they interview people, athletes after games and these kinds of things, and or they talk to musicians after they've improvised for a while, and so you get very different kinds of data from a lot of flow research than you do from cognitive control research, which tends to be much more tightly controlled. But because it's more tightly controlled, people come into the lab and they do these really boring, heinous things. That are going to produce negative experiences a lot of the time. So I'm suggesting it might be possible to run experiments that have participants perform a cognitive control test that's been gamified. So the task is one participants have to perform in the process of the game, and then you could manipulate a wide range of things. And maybe this has been done. I certainly don't have a firm grasp on all the science, but manipulate the difficulty of the task, and you can ask for reports along several dimensions. Somewhat in the way that a paper by Blair Saunders did from 2015. What does cognitive control feel like and they were just looking at the negative side of cognitive control. But you could do something like that in a task that might produce positive emotions. So you could think about effort, frustration, and boredom, but you could also think about absorption. You could think about confidence. You could think about a sense of control, something like an experience of fun. I don't know if that's the right way to describe it. And you could examine course performance signatures, persistence on the game, response time, and so on. So questions that would come up then: what kinds of costs influence cognitive control when participants are intrinsically motivated to exercise control? If they are, if there is something like intrinsic motivation to exercise control, how would these externally supplemented rewards interact with the intrinsic rewards provided by an engaging task? And there are other, questions you might ask. Are there limits to the way reward and experiential value might be bundled to influence decision making? I'm not sure if that's been posed super specifically. So these questions are kind of painfully programmatic, because at this stage, I'm not sure that much work's been done exploring this positive experiential side to cognitive control. So I think it's unclear from here how the topology of positive experiences is going to look, and how, positive and negative experiences might interact in cognitive control operations. So just in closing, I just want to, broaden things out a little bit. And I've been pleased to see other people in this workshop at least traffic in the same space of ideas, because I think when you start to think in terms of this variable phenomenology associated with cognitive control, you hit upon other areas of work that might be relevant, or at least might provide some fruitful ideas. So there are research programs that bear on the way I'm thinking of this. So the work on epistemic feelings, feeling of knowing, of uncertainty, forgetting, tip of the tongue phenomenology, work on metacognitive feelings. Joel can tell us a lot more about that. But feelings of confidence, fluency, familiarity, rightness, these kinds of things might be important. I missed Ophelia's talk because I had to give another talk, but I want to watch Ophelia's recording to see how she's thinking about metacognition in this connection. I think Elizabeth was hitting on something that I'm actually quite interested in too. And Elizabeth, I'll send you a paper of mine on flow that's kind of not saying the same thing, but it's in the same neighborhood. So it's worth observing other branches of psychology have emphasized positive experiences. So there are connections between processing, fluency, and flow and positive phenomenology, but this work's really not well integrated yet with this cost-benefit approach to cognitive control resource allocation that I do find very promising. So the experience types in these literatures seem to have functions that aren't directly related to their valence, but the experiences are valence. So it's better to have an experience of confidence, I think, than an experience of error. It's better to feel that some information is on the tip of the tongue than to feel that you've forgotten the information. So you might look to this work to help fill out the topology of experiences that inform cognitive control. And so it's possible that these epistemic and metacognitive experiences have some impact on whatever the calculation is, whether it's all cost balance or whether there are other dimensions worth considering. So yeah, thanks.